And this is going to be a sort of first look, and it's fun to take these first looks, and it's also fun as you're kind of using them in drafts. And Ben, one of the things that you and I have talked about some is the viability and the importance of projections. We did several evergreen shows on that last year, talking about how projections have a lot of value. And certainly you and I both know some people who do unbelievable projections. We do also know that those projections then influence ADP. And yet, when we come back at the end, one of the things that perhaps is even more important is this idea that we know that ADP is going to be incorrect, expert rankings are going to be incorrect, and getting too caught up in that type of mindset in terms of drafting can be a little bit of a problem. And so one of the things that you and I wanted to do here was to look at the positions through the lens of drafting and through the lens of scenarios. As you mentioned, how can we get scenarios that we think will work together? How can we get scenarios that are priced in a way that if we're right, we actually win, as opposed to it more or less just being a wash? This is going to be a fun exercise because this is, again, the starting point. If things kind of go to plan, and we may mix this up because the future show idea that we have for it is a little bit more involved, but we are kind of hoping to take a team by team and sort of division by division look at the fantasy players and play out how the season could work, how the different teams could utilize their players, and what that would mean from a scenario-based perspective, and how could we get exposure to those scenarios, our tiers versus the prices. Obviously, the players you can get from a tier that are less expensive are going to be people that you are looking at even more. But sort of a funny thing in terms of the direction that I'm going with drafting in terms of my own rankings. And listeners know my rankings are up on the site. They are in tiers, so you can use that element of it. You can kind of look across positions with that as well. But then I didn't actually use my rankings in drafts last season and didn't use them very much in the previous year either. Those are two of the really successful seasons that I've had. Thinking more in terms of scenarios, thinking more in terms of how you can get the most bang for your buck at each pick as you go through, how you can create exposure to the types of outcomes that you think are possible within a given season, and to do that inexpensively or as inexpensively as possible. That's really the key thing that we're looking at here from a draft perspective. So I think that'll be a fun element for these shows. And again, I mean, these are going to be sort of a quick look, a first look. We're going to go into more detail later, but Ben, I'm excited to jump in with you here. And we're going to be using the FFPC ADP tool from RotoViz for the show. We're going to be looking at the slim format. This is a format that I think the ADP from this you can use in a lot of different things. So if you're not playing FFPC, this is still relevant to you in terms of what the prices of these players are. We'll also be looking at a little bit from a best ball perspective right now. Obviously, a lot of the drafts that are going off are best ball. That does change the dynamic at QB. In best ball, you want to have two. You want to have two guys in the window. In regular redraft, you might be a little bit more gutsy in terms of trying to hit that last guy that you think is relevant, and then maybe trying to hit some flyers, knowing that you're not trying to take the best of the two scores every week. You're going to have to start a player. Now, there are still going to be elements where being able to have a couple of good players and take the best matchup in any given week, that has some benefit. But we do know that the quarterbacks are much less expensive in redraft than they are in best ball because of that dynamic.
Which follows and makes sense, obviously. And, jumping into quarterback right away, the big discussion over the last few years has been sort of this rise of an elite tier that, you even look 3-4 years ago, kind of before Patrick Mahomes burst onto the scene, and then Lamar Jackson the year behind him as back-to-back MVPs. We were in a very comfortable sort of late round QB era where, I mean, Mahomes and Jackson themselves were examples of players that could come from the, outside of the top 10 drafted quarterbacks and be the overall QB1. You had some players that were fairly consistently near the top, but even guys like Aaron Rodgers, who had done that for several seasons, was having a little bit of a poor stretch of performances. Has obviously since rebounded with the MVP seasons. But you have a different outlook now at the top, where the emergence of those two guys, the emergence of Josh Allen and Justin Herbert and Jalen Hurts' really impressive rushing profile, Kyler Murray, obviously, we now have this top tier of players that can score in ways that, we've long, obviously, in this community talked about the value of rushing quarterbacks. You can go back to our buddy Rich Rebar's Konami Code, moniker for the rushing ability, how useful that is, both from a floor and a ceiling perspective. He always points out when he was first writing about it, he was talking about, again, this era of more pocket passers, and you could go get the Tim Tebow's and the Terrell Pryors really late or off waivers. And those guys couldn't really throw much, but because of the really strong rushing value they could provide, they could bridge that gap between, they could bridge that cost gap, as a free waiver wire pickup or a late round pick, between that and what it costs to acquire a top 5 quarterback. Today's day and age, we now have those guys' rushing ability or better and very strong passing ability all in one package with some of these top quarterbacks. It's definitely changed the discussion. One of the things that I have felt, and I'm really curious about your opinion on this, but as especially as you look at these early best ball drafts, as quarterbacks are a lot pricier, that quarterback window kind of creeps up, right? I think when you were first writing about it, it was maybe like round 9 to round 11 or round 7 to round 9-ish. But it was probably the QB 7, QB 8 through QB 12, QB 13. I don't know, something like that. In today's day and age, to get the QB 7 or to get the QB 12 or whatever, you're basically paying an extra round or a couple of rounds. And yet we're still, as a community, understanding of not taking quarterbacks in the first round or in the second round. That late round quarterback element has still stuck. And so I wonder if the purest value in these drafts sometimes is that top tier where there's still opportunity cost, but you get into like sort of the running back dead zone. You're in the round, preferably not round 3, but round 4, 5, 6 range. And those quarterbacks do have such a higher ceiling than the quarterbacks you can maybe get in the 7, 8, 9 range. Just looking at this tool that you were mentioning, the ADP tool. I mean, you have Tom Brady in the 7th round, right? Tom Brady can do a lot as a pocket passer, can throw a lot of touchdowns, but like his ultimate ceiling cannot touch the ultimate ceiling for a Lamar Jackson or a Kyler Murray, when those guys could potentially throw, for similar numbers, but then also add 800 rushing yards. And so it's interesting that top tier, how much should we value that top tier?
It's tough, right? Because you're going to get some monster scores from those QBs. And Josh Allen last year, even at his expensive price, was very effective in leagues and in tournaments. And so then the natural thing is for drafters to reach a little bit more and say, even if I pay a little bit more, I'm going to still get that value out of that player. And especially if I build my overall team in a way that works, I can maybe survive having passed on that round 3 value, and I'll get into the end of the season and the upside on a weekly basis justifies that pick. And so a little bit here, we're almost looking at different dynamics in a regular best ball league or a tournament scenario. But one of the things that we have seen, when you talk about that window and you get up, earlier than the 5th round, and you're giving up so much in order to take these guys. And so I'm looking at the NFL Weekly Explorer. I'm looking at the expected points over the last couple of seasons for these QBs. You have Josh Allen at 24.4, Herbert at 23.4, Prescott just over 23, Mahomes 22.5, Murray 22.5, Brady just under 22. The gap over the rest of the group when you're looking at opportunity is perhaps not as great as it seems. Now, we also have very good numbers in terms of fantasy points over expectation for guys like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. And that fits in with what you and I talk about all the time, where we want to have exposure to the most talented players, that these guys are going to consistently hit on some of the high-end outcomes that help you in fantasy. But kind of going back to your point on the QB window, it is that tension between having the very top guys and having a couple of guys at more palatable prices. And even now that we're seeing an environment in which it's easier to predict how the quarterbacks are going to go, and quarterback ADP is more reflective of how they actually finish, I think we still want to avoid paying prices that don't really work. So that kind of gets us back to this conversation of how can we get that upside and not have to overpay. And the two players that I always come back to who have the upside, but also maybe have a little bit of the risk, which is why you can get them at a little bit of better prices, would be Lamar Jackson and Kyler Murray. Jackson has that ADP in the second half of the 5th round. Murray has an ADP in the first half of the 6th. But in individual drafts, you will definitely see them fall further than that. And quarterback is definitely a position where you're looking for the guys who fall in your draft, as opposed to being locked on to too many people that you have to have. Being able to take the fallers in any given draft allows you, number one, to get value. That always helps. Number two, you're able to create some different exposures, not have such a heavy roster number for any individual player that when that guy goes down, and quarterbacks do have problems with injuries, right? So we don't want to be like 75% Lamar Jackson. But you look at those two guys and you combine that rushing upside that you mentioned with the potential to outperform, that I think actually gives them the highest upside of any of the players. You look in, obviously the overall expected points are comprised of passing EP and rushing EP. You have 4 really high profile quarterbacks who are above 4.5 in terms of rushing expected points, having more than a touchdown worth of EP just on the rushing side, just so valuable. And those guys, not surprising. Josh Allen, as you mentioned, Jalen Hurts, and then Murray and Jackson. Murray and Jackson in terms of the high end outcome, and not even talking about like some extreme, everything goes right and they're leading their team to a Super Bowl type of outcome. But you look at Kyler Murray in the last 2 years before he's gotten hurt, weeks 1 through 11 in 2020, averaging over 31 points per game. Then comes back last year, weeks 1 through 7, averaging 27 points per game. If he could stay healthy, then, Murray is just an absolute slam dunk at his price. You look at Lamar Jackson over the previous 2 seasons before he has the injury-plagued 2021, he's averaging 27 points per game, has 77% QB1 finishes. When you talk about them as being the beginning of the QB window, if you're looking for upside, I think you've got to go that direction.
Yeah, and you note that the big similarity between the two is they were both hurt for periods last year. And so you get this recoil a little bit where we didn't get a full season from either of them. Kyler, when he came back, I know he had his first game back. I want to say he only threw like 20 passes or something. Maybe it was up in Chicago. I can't remember the exact game, but very, very poor from a passing volume statistical perspective, and had a couple other games that weren't great, still sort of working back from that injury. But we've seen the upside for both of these guys already. Kyler in 2020, you mentioned, started so hot, still finished as the overall QB2, not far behind Josh Allen, who led all quarterbacks that year. 2019, obviously, Lamar Jackson blew the world away with one of the greatest QB seasons of all time. So you have, just over the last couple of years, both of these guys have already actually shown us that, when it's not even theoretical. They seem like no-brainers. And if you're going to target these really expensive quarterbacks, it seems, as you said, number one, we want to try to get them after ADP. Number two, it seems very helpful, frankly, that they are organized within this tier in a way that they're two of the guys that have the most upside are the ones that can fall to the back of that sort of top 6, top 7, and sometimes fall pretty far. We did that super flex draft a couple of weeks ago, and we almost got Kyler Murray at 111 in super flex. And, it's a great example. I think he went QB8, if I'm not mistaken, at the 10th pick. If he can fall all the way to QB8, that's just a smash pick. It's a really easy pick, I think, with the upside he provides over the players directly, behind him. You're looking at Tom Brady, you're looking at, Russell Wilson, who there's a lot of excitement there, but Kyler's added weapons this year too, and so pretty excited for the Arizona offense. So the first step, I think, I'm right there with you on that. This elite tier, if you want to target it, you want to get good prices, and it's pretty nice to highlight those two players as really huge upside possibilities that also can be the ones that are the ways to play this tier cheaply. But as we start to move, further into the draft, say you miss all of those names, the opportunity cost at various picks is not where you want it to be. You don't, there's some wide receiver that you just have to have, and then you don't get that cheap price or that opportunity to take the quarterback where it makes sense. And when we often talk about when things start to flatten at other positions, that's when it makes sense to pull the trigger on the quarterback. Then you have to make a plan for what to do next, because, I'm looking at the ADP tool. You have Josh Allen in round 3, Patrick Mahomes in 4, Herbert and Lamar in 5, Burrow, Kyler, and Hurts all in 6. But in 7, round 7, you have Tom Brady, Russell Wilson, and Dak. In round 8, Aaron Rodgers and Matthew Stafford. And in round 9, you have Derek Carr, and you're into Deshaun Watson territory. This is in a tight end premium format on FFPC. If you're playing on Underdog, these quarterbacks are going even higher. But we're talking about, Derek Carr, who you love, but Derek Carr in round 9 compared to Kyler Murray potentially when he falls after ADP in late round 6 or even sometimes early round 7. To me, there's just no question that I would prefer to take Kyler at that more expensive price. But if you do miss him, now we have to start to build a new plan. And there's a lot of really interesting quarterbacks the further you get down. There's people that have made strong cases for Carr, adding Devontae Adams and weapons and new coaching staff. I've seen a lot of strong cases for Kirk Cousins, not a guy I'm a huge fan of, but new offensive system could be very positive for him. Certainly Trey Lance presents the Konami code rushing upside ability, and there's a lot of optimism for him. You can go further down the list, and you have Tua adding Tyreek Hill. You have Matt Ryan in a new situation. Justin Fields has that rushing ability. Terrible offensive situation, it appears. But there's a lot of names. You can go even further. Zach Wilson, all these weapons. Daniel Jones, has Brian Dable now. Everything has shifted, it feels like, on all of these teams. What is your preference when you don't hit on any of those top tiers? Do we want to then be looking in the round 7, 8, 9 range? To me, that's a little bit too pricey. I do like Russell Wilson. I've talked favorably about him this offseason. I think I'm higher than you on Dak. I do still like what Dak could potentially bring. But drafting those guys around behind, that elite tier, I want to get discounts on them too. And I'm not sure we're getting discounts where they're at. So it does present an interest, how do you solve this quarterback question when you don't get one of the top guys?
Yeah, and I'd like to throw it back to you and ask about Brady, who was someone who comes in, just after the Allen Herbert level in EP from last season. And then because he was so efficient, had those weapons, he added a couple of fantasy points above expectation. We have some interesting elements here with quarterbacks who could, I think, have some risk because of age or loss of weapons or a team shifting a little bit what they do. And so one of the things with best balls, we have to have 2 quarterbacks in the window. And so you might take one of these top guys and then come back with someone like a Tom Brady or a Russell Wilson or Dak Prescott. I'm with you in that I don't have a lot of exposure to them because just one round later, they're going to have to really be good to justify that cost. And with Brady, you lose Chris Godwin, the replacements there. I mean, it seems like Gronkowski is going to play, but there's a potential to lose that. I mean, that offense, Bruce Arians retires. The dynamism might not be quite the same. And if it's not, Tom Brady is more of a round 10 pick. I mean, you could easily be 3 rounds early on him, which obviously not something we want to do. Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, one of the things that we talked about earlier in the offseason is that you're now losing some of that rushing upside with these guys. I like Wilson, but I would prefer it to be in round 9. You've got those upgraded weapons, but it's going to be a new situation. And in some ways, it might make more sense to be excited about the individual wide receivers than to go back and put it on Wilson there in case everything doesn't come together as fast as we're hoping. Prescott loses some weapons. Now, they brought some people in, but there's a little bit of a hope-based element to thinking, okay, CeeDee Lamb is going to be a superstar. Tolbert, Washington, Gallup comes back toward the early part of his timeline and makes an impact. So if you're looking at that from the perspective of he's not been as dynamic as a rusher, he would need to be very efficient. Can all of those things come into play? So then you avoid that tier unless they fall. You get to that next tier, which is Matthew Stafford and Aaron Rodgers. And as you mentioned, Stafford, with the way that they pulled back toward the end of last season and the way that they have added pieces to where maybe Stafford elevates those pieces, maybe the coaching staff and the scheme elevates those pieces. But you're basically talking about Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, right? Is that enough for a non-rushing quarterback where the team, if they dominate on defense, would kind of like to be run heavy? Do you want to pay that price? Aaron Rodgers, the same type of thing. In a situation where the team actually doesn't want to run very many offensive plays, doesn't want to be in shootouts, now doesn't have the weapons, do you pay that? So then you're around at Derek Carr. Do you want to pay for Derek Carr in round 9? Deshaun Watson, the wild card. I kind of like the way that you put this together. I think that Trey Lance in round 10 has to be somebody that you're targeting. But then, Ben, it gets tricky and fun because the next QBs, Cousins, Tua, are you going to make them the focal point of your season as you're trying to make a run to win, $1 million or $200,000 or what have you? You wrap back around into 12 and we get some of the upside guys with Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. Blair and I actually took Trevor Lawrence in our Superflex draft this week because he fell a full round. He's gotten some weapons upgrades as well, even though not a superstar. How are you looking at this kind of round 12 range, which also includes Matt Ryan? There's some enthusiasm for the Colts, but with the way he played last year, I mean, that feels like a Phillip Rivers type of situation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for some of the individual players in that offense, especially the running backs. But when you're betting on potential upside seasons, and then you mentioned the QB window, we really want to get 2 of the top 20 quarterbacks. But one little thing we might throw in there is if you have a quarterback outside that range ranked as QB 15, you wouldn't necessarily pass on that player or pay more to get a guy you have ranked lower. The flip side is that the reason the QB window exists is that when people emphasize these later picks and think that they're going to pan out, it tends to hurt their team. So we have that tension. So then as we get into that range, I mean, is it Trey Lance almost exclusively for you? We also have Justin Fields there. And I think that when you're looking at 2 quarterbacks, you're looking at winning tournaments, you're looking at the rushing upside. It's hard for me to target some of these passing QBs where they're going to have to be good to be competitive. And with the runners, just be decent.